So I sent out a tweet raising the question, did the signing of the Middle East peace agreement on yesterday at the White House by the United Arab Emirates, by the nation of Bahrain, and by the Israeli government, Benjamin Netanyahu, and also by Tribulation Trump yesterday at the White House, was that a catalyst that has been promoted by perhaps the single most visible end times preacher of Jack Van Impe? Did that event on yesterday signal or trigger the tribulation? I'm going to ask the engineer if he would bring up the footage of that. I want you to look at it, and some of you are probably aware of it. And then I want to raise the questions and try to go through a systematic way of examining Jack Van Impe and other evangelists' ideas about the tribulation based on a peace agreement, the signing thereof or the breaking thereof with the state of Israel. Mr. Engineer, roll that clip, please.
Playing out hours after history was made at the White House today. Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain together at a signing ceremony celebrating the Abraham Accords, the deal normalizing relations between the countries. The Palestinians calling the deal a betrayal, rockets fired from Gaza. And here's our chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz, tonight.
On the White House South Lawn, before a packed crowd, many not wearing a mask, history was indeed made today.
We'll sign a treaty of peace, diplomatic relations, and full normalization.
Israel's prime minister and the foreign ministers from Bahrain and the UAE joining President Trump to officially normalize diplomatic relations with Israel, the first Arab countries to do so in decades.
To all of Israel's friends in the Middle East, I say, Assalamu alaikum, peace unto thee.
The agreements mean embassies will be opened in each other's countries. Commercial flights can operate between nations.
Together, these agreements will serve as the foundation for a comprehensive peace across the entire region.
President Trump proclaiming this a peace agreement, but the countries were not at war. And left out of the deal, the Palestinians, who call the agreement a betrayal.
At some point when they decide that they want to live better lives, I believe that they'll engage.
No sign of that yet. Within minutes of the deal being signed, rockets were launched into Israel from Gaza. There are strong indications that other Arab nations could enter into a deal with Israel. President Trump saying maybe 7, 8, or 9 more, including, David, Saudi Arabia.
For the president and prime minister of the state of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, to greet the world at this auspicious signing in the language of praise of Allah with Assalamu alaikum is chilling. We are globally and those biblically in our heritage in the midst of Rosh Hashanah, the second highest holy celebration period of Israel and Christians, Rosh Hashanah. That this event has taken place in the midst of the High Holy Day celebration, and for Benjamin Netanyahu to speak in the tongue of blessing Allah with Assalamu alaikum is chilling. Even to a casual person of the observance of the tribulation and the wrath of God upon all of humanity for violating his statutes and his ordinances. Again, Jack Van Impe, perhaps the most noted, if you will, end times preacher, apocalypse preacher, and others, and there have been a string of them throughout the Southern Baptist evangelical teaching for decades now, stating that we will know we're in the tribulation by the signing of a peace agreement and the breaking of the peace agreement. Now, I'm not going to throw up any scriptures. I'm not going to put up the scriptures that they have touted because I think they have eisegetic those scriptures. That is to say, they have made those scriptures say what they want them to say. And what Jack Van Imper and the Southern Baptists and the evangelicals who have prognosticated, or at least spoke about or preached about, prophesied about the end times, have not used the words of Jesus to demonstrate the tribulation. But that having been said, I want to talk to that segment of religious people regarding the fact, if you believe in what has been now for decades, if not generations, of Billy Graham, Franklin Graham, and others who have long since indicated that we will know that the tribulation has been triggered by the signing of a peace agreement with the Arabs and the Jews. And they have rested many Pastor Criswell of the noted Pastor Criswell of the First Baptist Church of Dallas, Texas. It seemed like he was the pastor there for 100 years. They've all endorsed this thesis that the signing of a peace treaty would trigger the tribulation, that it would be God's sign that it is happening. And now we've got Tribulation Trump, who has brought these signings of United Arab Emirates and the nation of Bahrain, that they may sign an agreement of peace and cooperation now between the state of Israel and these two nations. There's another item I want to point up, and then I'm going to try to conclude this as well in terms of yes or no. But there's also a theology going on that has been pushed mainly by Christians and adopted to some degree by Jews. But to have this happen at Rosh Hashanah, to have this happen during the period of Rosh Hashanah is absolutely, it is blasphemous to say the very best thing about it. But the other item about the apocalypse and about Jack Van Imper, many Southern Baptist evangelicals pushing, is that there would be a building of the third temple. They say, many have said that, well, the tribulation will begin when the third temple is built. By the third temple, they really mean the fourth temple. But, Solomon built the first temple. Is that right? And it was burned down. It was burned with fire. Nebuchadnezzar and Nebuzaradan rode horses up and down the aisles of that beautiful temple that Solomon built. And in the Holy of Holies, where God rested on the mercy seat with the gold, they rode horses back into the Holy of Holies, where even if the priest went and had an ounce of sin in him, God would kill him when he went into the Holy of Holies. And Nebuzaradan rode his horse back there and took his men and took the gold of the cherubims and the mercy seat and took it back to Persia. That temple was burned with fire. Ezra and Nehemiah returned 70 years later and rebuilt the temple and rebuilt the wall. That was the second temple. The actual third temple was built by Herod the Great. Herod, who was the great architect, who built Masada and a ton of other things around Israel, built a splendid temple, more beautiful in many regards, Herod being this great architect, more beautiful than the temple that was built by Solomon, if you can imagine that, and historians say it's so. And then that temple was destroyed. Jesus took his disciples across the Kidron Valley and sat on the Mount of Olives and said, this temple, not one stone will be left upon another until it's all torn down. And that was a beautiful temple that had been built by Herod the Great. And it was torn down in 70 AD when the Romans rode in and had that great war with the Jews, the Jewish war. Now, so that was a third temple. There's been no temple. There have been synagogues built, and even though they call some of them these Jewish houses temples, they mainly are now kabbads, which are synagogues. But there's been no actual, the fact that they're talking of building a third temple is a grammatical misnomer. But many Jews and evangelical Christians believe that at Bethel, where Jacob lay his head on a stone and saw the angels descending up and down on a ladder, is where the third temple, if there was going to be another temple built, it would be built as the fourth temple. Actually, the Dome of the Rock is now where the temple used to be built, the Islamic house where you see that gold dome that was given to them in the first days of war by Moshe Dayan. The great Israeli general just signed the Dome of the Rock, having no concept of how sacred that ground was, gave it to the Muslims. And now the Muslims occupy the place of Abraham and what is now known as the Dome of the Rock, that gold the Aqsa Mosque of the Islamic faith. They say that would also, the building of the third temple, that which would actually be the fourth temple, would be, again, the trigger of the tribulation. So I want to point all that out. I'm not going to use any scriptures because I believe that Jack Van Amprey and others, they misinterpreted the scriptures, and they did not interpret the tribulation or the trigger of the tribulation or the sign of the tribulation based on what Jesus said in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 24. But as you know, I have been teaching about the tribulation myself for quite some time. So yesterday, Benjamin Netanyahu got up and said, Assalamu alaikum. If there's ever been a sellout of God, if there's ever been a sellout of the Jewish people and its faith, that has to be worse than what Judas did to Jesus. But that ain't all. What was it that caused the United Arab Emirates and also Bahrain, what was it that caused them to sign a peace treaty? What did Jared Kushner offer them? Now, we haven't read, or I haven't seen the text of the agreement, but it has been rumored that both Bahrain and United Arab Emirates have been offered a catch of F-34 fighter jets. That's the meanest, baddest thing flying anywhere and any time. It's badder than anything China has. It's badder than anything Russia has. That F-34 fighter jet will make Russia and China's fighter jets look like they're flying kites in the air. That's a bad mama jammer. And if Russia, if China, if America has given those as a deal to get them to the table, make them sign, giving them those planes. And you remember going in Florida and Pensacola, where the Saudi Arabians, remember, that were training to learn how to fly, how to do mechanics work on the F-43 fighter, that this fella shot up several people down at that Pensacola Air Force Base, remember, going back a year ago, and they expelled all those Saudi Arabian students who were learning how to fly those planes, how to be the mechanics, how to really take care of those planes, send them all back to Saudi Arabia because of this one terrorist activity that took place a year ago down in Pensacola at the Air Force Base down there, right? So the same thing would happen. Saudi Arabia already has them. Then to give them to Bahrain and to the United Arab Emirates is what I think, which is against the principle and the interest of the Middle East in general. Iran must be having a fit because Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, they're all adversaries. They are bitter enemies. And the most powerful force in the Middle East, of course, other than Israel, is Iran, since Iraq has been castrated. So let me come back to the fact. It's what we saw in real time yesterday, the actual triggering of the tribulation. Now, some may argue, well, the signing is one thing. The treaty that they signed on yesterday has to be broken. And once that's broken, then the tribulation will begin. I'm personally not a fan of Jack Van Amprey. I am not a believer of the Southern Baptist Evangelicals peace treaty signing that triggers the tribulation. I'm not a believer theologically. They have not convinced me of that. They have not. However, with respect to the temple, I am concerned that the embassy was moved from Tel Aviv into Jerusalem by Tribulation Trump as well. So certainly there are some very disturbing things that are happening in the Middle East that certainly are of the tribulation mindset and sort, and to some degree of its prophecy. So I would say to you, I have been calling that we're in the tribulation already. I've been stating that. And while I don't agree with Jack Van Impe, I would prefer that he would agree with me. I'm the Lord's servant, that he would. But I would say this, that something's afoot. This is not normal. This is not normal. Now, we saw in the piece that we just video clipped to you a moment ago that in Gaza, the stomped down Muslims, the Palestinians, if you were excluded from this process, and they started firing rockets from Gaza into Israel. That means that they don't agree with this. And as you notice, the first place that Obama visited when he became president, his first foreign mission trip was to Egypt. That's where he went first. He did not go to Israel or to Europe. He went to Egypt. You'll remember that about the Mac Daddy. And you'll also remember the first foreign relations trip that Tribulation Trump took was to Saudi Arabia. Remember him dancing with that sword and dancing with Muhammad As-Salam? Remember that? Yeah, that's it. So they have all favored the Islamic, if you will, power and being a power broker in that region. I think it's important. But I have been teaching, and I will continue. We are in the tribulation now. There's no doubt about it. We're in it. But I wonder what the scholars have said. And I have one further thing I will say, and I promise not to inflict myself upon you any further. I watched Hannity last night. I didn't get a chance to watch Tucker Carlson because I was watching Woodward and Anderson Cooper, Bob Woodward's interview with Anderson Cooper. But I turned quickly to Hannity at 9 o'clock. And Hannity, Sean Hannity, the actual mouthpiece and press secretary for Tribulation Trump and the White House, the Trump administration did not lead last night with the peace signing. He didn't lead with the story that he led with. In other words, you lead with the big story. The biggest and baddest story of the day is what you lead with. He didn't lead with that last night. So if Hannity did not consider the signing agreement yesterday as the most important story of the day, why not? Is it perchance that Hannity realizes that there's been some bamboozling going on and that this peace treaty signing is not in the best interest of America or in the best interest of Christianity? But it does make Tribulation Trump look good. And perhaps he's backing off a bit. I don't know that to be a fact. All I know is that this should have been the lead story last night on Fox News all night long. It was not. Let me put it this way. You look at the front page of the New York Times. The most important story of the day, the biggest news item of the day of the New York Times, right, is the lead story. Across the headlines of the front page, above the fold, that's lead, right? You don't put the most important story of the day on page 8 in section A. And that's where Hannity and Fox News put this signing in their broadcast all night long. At least that's what I saw with Hannity. I cannot be as affirmed about that with Tucker Carlson. I said one final thing, and I wouldn't deflect myself upon you any further. But generally, when I say that, there's another infliction coming anyway. You know that, right? There's another infliction coming. And I want to raise this as a question, as an apocalyptic question. The fall of Jerry Falwell Jr. and Liberty University has got to be the biggest fall in Southern Baptist evangelical Christianity since the fall of Jimmy Swaggart. And maybe even superseding that of Jimmy Swaggart. Jerry Falwell Jr. was the son of Jerry Falwell, the founder of the Moral Majority, and who put together a political organization that's still in vogue today as the most powerful religious right group of voters in America. Southern Baptists, evangelicals, the Grahams, and everybody else, and Salem Media, all of that under the Moral Majority of Jerry Falwell, pastor of the Liberty Baptist Church in Lynchburg, Virginia, founded the Liberty University. And his son, Jerry Falwell Jr., has two sons. One, Jerry Falwell, another son, I forget his first name, is the pastor of the Liberty Baptist Church. And Jerry Falwell Jr. took charge of the Liberty University. They don't speak to one another. They haven't spoken to one another in years. But the fall of Jerry Falwell Jr. is perhaps more significant than the fall of Jimmy Swaggart. And all this is happening now at a period that we're now referring to as the tribulation. I think there's more that would be said about this. I want you to contemplate that, especially those of you who are aware of the end times prophecy given, by so many about the tribulation. Contemplate it, and we'll get back to talk about it a little bit later. But I want you to know of an assurity, sign of a peace treaty or no peace treaty, we are in the tribulation. I'm James David Manning, everybody. I'm the Lord's servant. This is a bit of a news blog we do, looking at spiritual wickedness in high places for the most part, making some observations about it and giving people a biblical foundation to the way of interpreting, rather than have Sean Hannity or Laura Ingraham or Janine Pirro or Anderson Cooper or Rachel Maddow or Don Lemon, Rush Limbaugh interpret what's going on in the world. You come to me and I'll tell you based on what the Word of God says. They'll just give you their worldly, sinful view. But the Manning Report will tell you what God has said, whether to say yea or nay, whether to go or to stay. You'll be led by the word of Almighty God. Come to the Manning Report on a daily basis to interpret the spiritual wickedness in high places, because there's plenty of it that's going on. And so I'm the Lord's servant, James David Righteous Rebel Manning, and I'm here to serve you with news and information.